When we're trying to understand what a proper economic structure is, a proper theology of work, it happens really within the context of a fraternal economy, or what some popes have called a gift economy. But we just need to recognize that money actually totally transforms our relationships. And in some cases, you just need to keep far from it.
Hey everyone, what is up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Austin, and this is Gospel Simplicity, a place where we seek to bring simplicity out of theological and historical complexity. Today we are talking about something that impacts all of us. We're talking about work and money, and just how profoundly we often misunderstand these things, not just in our culture, but in our churches as well. And I'm joined by none other than Dr. Jacob Imam, who you might know from his show, New Polity. We had a fascinating discussion, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. Well, Dr. Jacob Imam, thank you so much for joining me today. It is an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And I first came across your work from an interview you did with Matt Farad on Pints with Aquinas, this really small YouTube channel that a couple people in my audience might have heard of once or twice. And it was about friendship, and it was such a refreshing episode. But what really caught my attention was your vision of building Christian communities and what you're up to in Steubenville. And I have to say, just as an aside, I was listening to that episode with my wife, and the other day we were driving through this like dilapidated part of town. And since listening to that, she said like, man, the Catholics need to move here after hearing what you guys are doing in Steubenville. So just shout out to you guys for that. But talk to me a little bit about what you guys are up to in Steubenville, your vision of a Christian community, and all of that.
Yeah, you know what? We really do believe that when Christ declares himself king, that really has major implications for the way that we live, and that when we have a new relationship as subject to monarch to king, that changes your relationship citizen to citizen as well, and that this kingdom that Christ does bring to the earth and is bringing to this earth certainly comes first and foremost in and through our hearts, but it manifests itself visibly, powerfully in the world. And so we are trying to change our hearts by the help of his grace, and as a result of changing our beliefs and behaviors, it's also manifesting in changing the pattern and the order of our city as well. So when I converted to Catholicism, I say that I was so excited to have this intimate relationship with Jesus Christ, but I was tired of just kind of going to mass every day and praying, every day, but wanted to be a real Christian more than just an hour or so a day. And that is the gift that the church has given us in Catholic social teaching, where our whole lives can be reformed to better image the very likeness of Christ himself, and to manifest it in this world. And so we move from a city that had kind of its structures well in place to a dilapidated Rust Belt town where there was hardly any structures to be spoken of. And we've been trying to build new businesses that better reflect the principles that the church has taught us to build with. So again, to better reflect God's glory to the world, and to let that be a shining light to those who are yet unbaptized. So we're building things like, mundane things like breweries, more fun things like farm to shelves, grocery stores, and a new college that simultaneously trains people in the Catholic intellectual tradition as well as the skilled trades, and so as to graduate from college financially net positive instead of up to their eyeballs in debt, as too often happens today. And so from kind of the heights of the theoretical, we get pretty down and dirty into the practical as well.
I love that. There's so much I could follow up on here, and we may follow up on a couple things. One, I can imagine many of my viewers saying, I'm not sure breweries are mundane, but I'll just leave that to those people to decide. But one thing I thought was really interesting, you mentioned kind of taking these principles of Catholic social teaching as you're thinking about what it means to kind of build the kingdom of God there in your local area. And I think for a lot of my viewers, they may be familiar with certain aspects of Catholic social teaching, right? Like certainly they probably know that the Catholic Church is very pro-life, or they've gone through other
Mm,
areas. But I think specifically when it comes to like a theology of work
mhm.
and community building, it's an area of Catholic social teaching that I think is very rich, but perhaps untapped for a lot of people. So, what are some of those principles that you're following, that you're keeping in mind as you're thinking about these different projects, whether it's building farms, breweries, or a college?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's like the $1,000,000 question. Work has had such a different meaning throughout the years. I mean, if you go back and look at pagan societies prior to Christ, it doesn't matter which one you look at. Work is always considered to be a sign of servitude. It's real drudgery. It's toil. The Atrahasis, which is this Akkadian creation myth, actually begins with that when the gods were bound by their drudgery, and that they did the work instead of men. That the thing that divides the divine from humanity is not some overarching understanding of transcendence, um, but but actually who has the power to work or command others to work. Aristotle understood work to be demeaning, and that's why we have slaves. Cicero too thought that the craftsman was a vile art. So when Jesus Christ, the Word become flesh, picked up a hammer and spent most of his life at the carpenter's bench, it absolutely was political dynamite in the face of all these pagan religions. And so when we are kind of converting out of a post-Christian society and trying to, you know, welcome Christ more truly into our hearts, and beg his help in becoming better images of him, a lot of that actually has to do with rolling up our sleeves and getting to work ourselves. And so I think that's, a big side of this, is that in our humility, we actually have to become hidden workers again. I think that a big emphasis that you find throughout Catholic social teaching is in the proper understanding of the cosmic order itself. That love is not just the thing that should define Christians, but it actually is the thing that defines the universe itself. That all of creation is one gift from God, and that all of our interactions happen within that context of givenness, of gratuity. And so when we're trying to understand what a proper economic structure is, a proper theology of work, it happens really within the context of a fraternal economy, or what some popes have called a gift economy, which might sound sentimental or even naive, but it's properly ontological, and it's real, and it's something that we need to recognize, that we are first and foremost called to enter into the Holy Trinity, who is declared to be love itself. And so, as the more that um, we can start to pattern our work in a way that is self-giving, truly edifying for our neighbors, then we're on the right track. So much our current society is dominated by mammon. I mean, just everything is for sale today. I mean, there's nothing that doesn't have a price tag on it, pretty much. And and then yet there's this old Catholic principle that money takes the place for where love lacks. And you can think about it really simply, such as I can either call up a moving company to help me move my piano, or I could call up my friends. That I am dependent upon other people in either situation. But in one case, I'm using the currency of money, and the other the currency of love. One, there is alienation, where I don't know the people that are helping me. The other, they're very active helping me, is what is further binding us together. And so when we are trying to kind of prioritize a true fraternity in our economy and in our work, that there is that priority of love, of understanding that obviously there are plenty of great occasions to use money, but are we utilizing money in a way that it becomes ubiquitous throughout society, and thus pushing away the opportunities for self-giving in the ways that really it should. And so when St. Thomas Aquinas is commenting on St. Paul's great verse that the love of money is the root of all evils. He says it's not the love of money in and of itself, as if you're just trying to accumulate more and more and more, as the real problem. It's really when you're trying to use money as a means for everything that is the problem there. That it takes away the opportunity for love, which of course is our end, and so it's a root of all sorts of sin. I think these are some of the the first principles of like the goodness of manual work and the priority of love that really defines the shape of the human economy in a way that that again better reflects the Holy Trinity Himself.
Yeah, there's so much to get into there, and we will as this interview goes on. I want to talk specifically about kind of the theology of work and money. But before we
Great.
get there, you mentioned that we live in this society that's dominated by mammon today. And I think when people hear you talking about kind of the fundamental order of the cosmos being love and this gift economy and, having friends help you move rather than paying for it and expanding that out into kind of all areas of the economy, at least as far as we can, it's a compelling picture, but it's also very far from where we're at today. Like you said, money dominates everything. It's just kind of the waters we're swimming in. I'd be curious, before we get into kind of more of maybe some of the solutions and some of the ways in which we can be rethinking this, how did we get where we are today? If we went from kind of this pagan view of work being a bad thing, whether we're going all the way back to like the ancient Near East or to, Greek and Roman society, but then, at least theoretically, we have this rise of Christendom where we should be doing something different. And now we're living in a time kind of post-Christendom in many ways where the economy you're talking about, there's this compelling picture of a gift economy and one kind of marked by Catholic social teaching is just completely foreign to us. And even I think those within the church are unfamiliar with these elements of the Christian tradition. So how did we get where we are today with our view of work and money?
The history is fascinating. There's so many nuances and major moments that come out throughout it. But I think the largest and most important part of it is that you cannot have the goods of Christ, the real benefits of Christendom as it once was, and then maybe recapitulated again in our current age, without Christ Himself. I mean, it's not just that He brought new ideas and said, like, opened up our minds, but He actually gave us the power to open up our hearts to actually live differently. This is the real grace of the sacraments, that they do enable us, they empower us to live differently. And so when people always default to natural law can probably sort us out again and give us a vector of the ways in which we should be tending, I always think to myself, well, in some regard, yeah, absolutely, that's true. I mean, many authorities in the church have said that if we had not fallen, we would have only needed the book of nature to be able to know God. But we're not there anymore. We needed the extra help. We needed special revelation too. But even more than that, we can't do this just by ideas alone. We need to do this by the very person of Jesus. And so there's just no hope without Him. And so I think that the narrative of the decline of Christendom is just one that's marked by a apostasy, moving away from Christ and away from His church, which is His very dwelling. So I really do think that is the narrative, and we can kind of go through. I think this history is very fascinating, but maybe that's for a different time.
This video is brought to you in part by Faithful Counseling. Faithful Counseling is an organization of Christian counselors that exists to help you get the help you need. You can find them by going to faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity. And when you use that link, which you can find in the description down below, you will get 10% off your first month, and they'll pair you up with a licensed mental health counselor in under 48 hours. Once you've been paired up with a counselor, you can reach them via instant message, phone call, video call, and more. I think you will really enjoy this, and I think it could be the first step on your journey to greater mental health. And mental health problems affect all of us, religious, non-religious, old, young, every demographic feels the weight of mental health. But there are resources available, and you don't need to go through this alone, which is why I encourage you to reach out to the amazing people at Faithful Counseling by using that link, faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity, and taking your first step towards healing and wholeness in your mental health. Yeah, I'm sure you can go through the history at quite a length. I believe that was kind of part of your PhD work, if I'm correct, right? Looking through kind of like
No,
medieval, or no? Okay.
but Andrew Jones, who's my colleague,
Ah,
that's
okay.
certainly part of his. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I do have just one kind of biographical question for you as you talk
Sure.
about the importance of like the church and the sacraments and really
Mhm.
reimagining not just like our own lives, but in economies, right? And in the world as a whole there, that we can't have the goods of Christendom without Christ himself. I'd be
Mhm.
curious, just, obviously this is a topic you're very interested in now, work, money, etc., how we think about those things.
Yeah.
Did that happen prior to your conversion to Catholicism? As though like you were interested in these things, and then you found Catholicism as kind of the answer to these questions, or was it you were interested in the Catholic Church, and then as you went deeper into that, you discovered that there's this richness of teaching that maybe you weren't aware of? I'd just be curious, kind of what came first for you.
Yeah, it was definitely the latter for me. I was raised by kind of a liberal Muslim father and a happy evangelical mother, and just some point, as a lot of people do, came to have a real conviction that I had sinned, and so I needed some sort of real help, and I kind of turned to my father's God first, and there was kind of nothing but do better, try harder, where there was a real substantial um, answer to this problem of sin, a description of it that actually went even deeper, that made my sin out to be even more vile, and horrible than I had even thought it was, and finding a real solution to that in the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I just fell in love with him and wanted the more and more intimacy with him. And so I say that if anybody wants a more intimate relationship with Jesus Christ, you can't find a more intimate relationship with him than in the Catholic Church. And so I was received into the church, and then as I kind of came to know this deep treasury, this vast treasure that she has of ways of knowing him more, and finding that greater intimacy with him, I discovered Catholic social teaching, and that rocked my world. My dad was in finance for his whole career. He taught me how to invest from a very early age. It just dominated our life. And so when I finally was at a place where I thought, this is kind of strange that I haven't really heard too much about money and finance coming out of the church. It was kind of these extraordinary moment where I realized that, well, Christ certainly claims that too. What is it? And so it was certainly an academic project, but it was, as all academic projects should be. It should also have a real sway over your life, too. And so, as I kind of went back into the tradition, and found these things, and discovered for me, found them for the first time, what was kind of the mainstream of the church for ages. It really rocked my world, and I had to change a lot all throughout it. So it was definitely something that was not a question that was like really like nagging at my heart, but I just thought it was a void. And when I discovered it, I thought, wow, there's a lot of me that needs to change.
Yeah, and I bet that was a jarring experience because few things hit home as much as our money, at least for many of us, because it's become so central to our lives. And that's why we get so uncomfortable when churches start talking about finances and everyone just kind of begins to get on guard. But I think it's something we need to do and do well. But speaking
Yeah,
of kind of voids in teaching, one
yeah.
thing that your work has helped kind of highlight to me is those all of the years of Jesus' life spent at a carpenter's bench. It's something that
Mhm.
I didn't ever really grow up considering. And perhaps it's by just the nature of it's not, when we get the gospels, we're getting a very small window of Jesus' life for the most part, right?
Mhm.
But we do have this knowledge that he worked as a carpenter, and we don't often do much with that. At least in the tradition I grew up in, it was just kind of like a passing fun fact that you happen to know about Jesus. But you pull out that there's actually there's major takeaways we should have from Jesus' life as a tradesman. So what should we kind of deduce from this? What should we take away as the importance of work when we think about Jesus as a worker?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't want to kind of toss out answers too quickly because I think it's a point of that could be taken for very deep reflection for a very long time. And so that would be the first thing I kind of encourage people to do. That this is not because the Gospels record the most important points of Christ's life. That like each sentence, each fact is so densely packed with meaning that this is just one of them that we should take to prayer and to deep contemplation. I think a major part of it is no doubt that he's coming um, to define what true humanity is. And when we look at kind of this Aristotelian tradition, you get an understanding of the world as being intrinsically good. And so when man changes any part of it, it actually starts to degrade it. And the Christian tradition says that's just not the case at all. In fact, when God hands on the world and he says it's very good, it's interesting that he doesn't say that it's perfect. No, it becomes completed, it becomes absolutely finished, his God's own work upon the cross, and that's what Christ himself says. But there's interesting is an interesting fact that God allows, actually finds in the fulfillment of the world itself our participation in his own creative act. That we can take parts of his creation and we can reform them, take the forms that God created, and to give them a new nature, a new meaning. So um, I don't mean to get too theoretical here, but I think it's actually quite interesting that when you consider, say, a tree and you chop it down and you make a table out of it, you are you are choosing between one of two things. Like enjoying the goodness of the tree is mutually exclusive with enjoying the goodness of the table. And so there's that Aristotelian insight is right. You've taken away the enjoyment of one good for another, but there's no need to say that that's bad. You can say that they're both good. And our when God places us in the garden prior to the fall, he gives us the command to till and to and to keep and to have dominion. And this is the way in which we're doing that. And those words, abad vashamar in the Hebrew are again used of tilling and to keeping. They're again used in the Levitical code to talk about the conduct of priests, that these are liturgical acts, they are temple acts, and that our work is, in a true sense, a reception of the creation of the world and a self-giving into it that begins to construct a temple in which God himself can dwell, and ultimately, truly, physically in the incarnation, which is now with us for forever. So I really think that this movement into work and this reformation, the giving of a new form to created matter, is something that um, is absolutely tantalizing to consider, and that Christ did it himself and is showing us a true way is very interesting. It's shocking too to kind of consider that Christ didn't come as a farmer, whereas you think that a farmer is nurturing the very form of the created world that God created. A carpenter transforms it. And so he goes a step further than the archetypical worker of Adam, and shows us the archetypical work of the new Adam is in that transformation. So I think there's, anyways, a number of very deep points of consideration. I'll just for us to consider with our own work, but I think I'll just kind of end with this last point: is that um, the command to till and to keep and the command to have dominion is given exclusively to humanity. It's not given to the animals. They may be fruitful and multiply as we are, but they do not work as we work. Um, Pope St. John Paul II says that only humanity works. You might think of like a beaver building its dam, or a bird building its nest. But what work truly is a rational act where you have a concept in your mind, a new form that you then engender in the material world. You are actually taking a spiritual power and manifesting it in matter itself. And so, in that regard, there is a wedding that's happening between heaven and earth, and that creativity comes as a manifestation of God's own power. Like, we do it in such a lame way compared to him, but a real participatory way, as he does. And there is something true about the human act becoming more human, the more creative that it is. And a lot of us today think about creativity as something that is kind of innate, that we're just like born with some sort of creative power, and we're certainly born with some creative potential, but you only develop to become more creative the more hard work and the hard study that you do. So somebody that's just starting off as a carpenter is not going to do phenomenal work that everybody gawks over. Uh, After years and years and years of studying what other people have done, of trying it out himself, then he's going to be able to push the creative bounds even further, and making his own work even more creative, and thus more human, and thus more of a true participation in God. And so, anyways, there's just I think a million things that we could think of in terms of um, a real divine like spark in our work that only humanity is capable of. Um, and then we can kind of compare it also to our modern day economy and the modern ways in which we're working, and asking whether or not we're setting ourselves up to flourish that way. But the principle of Christ revealing humanity as carpenter, must still kind of be our north star, our lodestar, in the base of all this reflection.
We'll be right back to the episode, but first I want to say thanks to my patrons, subscribers, and merch buyers who make these episodes possible, especially to my patrons who give monthly to help the channel keep going and growing. Thank you all so much. And if you're interested in seeing this channel continue to grow and perhaps allowing me to invest more time in it to scale up the content that's coming out of it, then do consider becoming a patron. You can do so at patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. You'll get a host of fun perks, from discounts on merch, early access to interviews, exclusive access to academic content, and perhaps my favorite thing, the Gospel Simplicity Inside Circle Book Club, where we read classic patristic texts together with people from all over the world and learn from those who have gone before us. So if you want to support the show and get all kinds of cool perks, go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. There's so much there. Something that people might notice as you're talking is a lot of the kind of imagery that we're using of transforming the material world and tilling and harvesting, all of these things. They're not things that are necessarily really easy to map onto maybe our lived experience of work. Now, I imagine some people in my audience work in kind of a blue collar trade in which every day they're working with the material world and they're transforming things. But if we go back to the conversation we had just before we went live, you referred that, you could only hear me as a disembodied voice. And I think a lot of people feel that way kind of in their own work, right? That they don't actually work on things. They work in these abstractions for larger abstractions, and they're not really sure to what end they really work. It's just one part of a large cog in a machine, and there's not a lot of kind of connection to transforming anything or seeing something go from one material to another and thinking creatively and beautifully. I think it appeals to people, but when they think about their work in accounting or their work in podcasting or whatever it may be, it's hard to make that connection. And so what would you say for those people that find themselves in a more white collar setting, if you will, about how we can think theologically about our work when we're not working with something as tangible as a piece of wood or a plot of land?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say a couple of things, actually. One is that there is a real formation that happens through ideas. So when we talk about a thing's nature, a nature is derived from a thing's formal cause. So it's the form of a thing. Um, But when it pertains to ideas, the form of an idea is its content. So if I'm thinking about like the size of a building, say, then the nature of that idea is it's space. It's the content of it. And there's real transformation that's done, whether you're like an engineer, making that formational change, or if you're an academic, synthetically bringing new ideas together to be able to develop doctrine and develop thinking. Um, so that really happens, no doubt about it. But there is a lot of white collar work that is actually totally demeaning, and that there has been this kind of crazy lie that we've bought. All of us has bought. I mean, myself included, have bought. Where we have thought of blue collar work as lesser, and there's reasons for that, and which I think is probably helpful to go into in a moment. Uh, but we've thought that just because I'm doing this at a desk, that this is more dignified. But a lot of what we're doing is, a lot of us in management are just kind of pushing things forward, and there's not really a clear idea of the purposiveness. What's the real purpose of our work? And as a result, that means that we're losing not only motivation, but actually our capacity to be more creative in our role, to be able to, again, kind of synthetically bring different ideas together to help push it forward to the end that we're seeking. So I mean, I think that, that is just what John Paul II calls toil. And there's many different occupations, a lot of them blue collar, that are toilsome. And that's just a cross that a lot of us have to bear in the modern period. And a lot of people had to bear in the ancient period, obviously, too. It's just with us. And I think that giving that up, like actually really offering that up in suffering, is necessary. So I don't want to be too harsh on this, and obviously there's plenty of nuance that you can give positive ideas to it as well. But at the same time, we have to be realistic about where our market economy is today, and a lot of it is developed um, out of a forgetting Christianity and forgetting Christ. John Paul II says that work is always transitive, that there's always a subject working on an object. And he says what defines the Western economy so much today is that we have prioritized the objects that we are building more than the subjects who are building. And that is a total reversal of the natural order of the world and how things should be, because it is ultimately those subjects that we're trying to dignify, and it is ultimately those subjects whom we're trying to help get to heaven. And so the objects matter very little next to that. And a big error in the way that we've designed our work today has been more about products rather than persons.
That distinction between kind of work and toil interests me. And I'd also be
Hmm.
curious for people who find themselves in a job that feels more toilsome than something that's driven, like purpose driven work.
Hmm.
On the one hand, I'd like to just kind of double click on what the definition of toil, what we mean there. I think the idea of work having kind of the
Sure.
transitive nature is helpful, and maybe it's the inverse for toil. But also for people that say, like, yep, toil, that's going to describe what I do. Is the
Yeah.
is kind of the proper response to that for them? I imagine there's a lot of context here, right? But is it to try to find purpose in the midst of toil, or to say, like, this toil really is purposeless and that's kind of the cross I'm going to bear? Or is it
Hmm.
try to get out of that toil as fast as you can and do something else? I'd be curious, kind of on like a practical level, if people are saying, toil, that's me, I can check that box, what do they do with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think toil ultimately defines some form of labor that does not build up your own dignity, that makes you more in terms of the type of a cog in a vast machine, rather than a human exercising and developing your creative capacity. Um, and that's also defined by being dominated by others, that you're forced into a role that is answerable to another man that just wants objects and doesn't care about your subjects as well. And that's just a reality that's always existed and is a huge narrative throughout the Old Testament. Obviously, Pharaoh is the archetypical tyrant that sets us up in that way. But I would say too that we can't just blame individuals. We also have to blame ourselves, that we have collectively built up institutions in our society that have prioritized objects over subjects. I mean, we all do this. We can't just point to the elites and say it's their fault. We have allowed them to do this. So we all have to go to confession, and we all have to repent of this. And I think that there, um, within toil, we could certainly find the silver linings in our jobs, and that's probably quite helpful to do. But I would never think that it would be proper to just live in that pretense, where we're just believing that, well, there is this aspect of it that's good, and therefore it is good, and therefore this is all fine. I don't think that that's helpful psychologically. It's also just wrong morally. And so I would say that silver lining is something that, um, again, like, hold on to, but don't define the work by it if it truly is toil. And I would offer that up. I would say, Lord, help me unite with Christ in his own sufferings here, but also give me a path, by which I could, um, I might be able to transition. Like, just up and quitting your job is not an option for hardly anybody these days. Like, we're in these roles for a reason. We have to be able to provide for our families and such. But I would say making real prayers in earnest, fasting also, for the social change that we have participated in building, is kind of requisite on all of us today. Like, we all have this sort of collective prayer and fasting that we have to do, asking the Lord to, see us, under the fig tree crying out, and to rescue us, as he so longs to do.
So I want to get at perhaps a little
Mhm.
tension here that some people might be feeling. On the one end, there's
Yeah.
the kind of lived reality of you have maybe certain family obligations, you have your rent to pay, your mortgage to pay, whatever it is,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like
yeah.
you need this money,
Yep.
for better or worse because of the way that our society and maybe the decisions we've also made of kind of different lifestyle things, etc. But up and quitting, as you said, just isn't an option for most people. But you
Mhm.
also mentioned that there can be kind of a moral wrong in just kind of only taking the silver lining and kind of perhaps like deluding ourselves into thinking that what we're doing is actually good when it's perhaps like on a larger moral scale not good. And maybe to flesh this out a bit more, I'm thinking of someone who perhaps they work for like a major titan of industry, whether that's like an Apple, a Meta, a whatever, right?
Mhm.
And they feel that in their day-to-day role they're not like actively participating in some direct evil, but they feel
Yeah.
like maybe there is this tension between what that company is doing, like this kind of more remote evil removed from them, and how their role
Mhm.
might contribute to something like that. And so I could imagine them feeling this tension of, on the one hand, it's not possible just up and quit, but if what I'm doing is in some way at least remotely morally wrong, like what am I supposed to do with that? Because does in what way does that take precedence over some of my more kind of monetary desires? I know that's a complicated question, but for people who are kind of wrestling between the moral nature
Yeah.
of their work and the kind of practical concerns, what could we say there?
Yeah, I don't mean to escape a hard question, but what I think is helpful from at least academic vantage is giving the principles that the church has given. But these kind of personal decisions really have to be made at a pastoral level, which means some sort of personal knowledge. So I'm not going to enter into that, because I'm not actually even capable of doing that. But I will say this. First, a few things, three things. First, um, when I was trying to say that there might be some good to it, and that we shouldn't get carried away and then defining our careers based upon that good. That was a moral problem, precisely because you're never going to find anything in this life that is totally and absolutely evil. Evil is always a privation upon a good. That there is always some semblance of good in anything that exists, and so we will always be able to find, something positive to say. We could even say something positive about Satan himself, insofar as that he has an angelic nature. Um, so that's what I mean by that we will always be able to see a good, but just because there is some good does not mean that the structure itself should be uh, baptized, transformed by Christ
I see.
himself. So I think that's perhaps gives more nuance or clarity to what I was trying to say prior. Um, I also say that if you do find yourself in a place of remote cooperation and um and it's getting ever nearer to more direct cooperation in something that is actively stripping others away from their dignity, then you have to get out. You don't have a choice in that, and that you. But those are people who usually have some more financial um, stability and ability to pivot. Is that Christ, it does ask us to leave everything and to follow Him. And if you are in a job that is actively dehumanizing others, then you just need to leave it. For those who are kind of stuck in a place that's less financially um, uh, malleable, I suppose, then then it just becomes a really tougher question that I think needs to be addressed with a pastor. But we've created a lot of structures that inhibit our ability to give the gift of self to others. These are structures that, just like to name out a few examples really quickly, like we could say insurance is one of those. That if some disaster happens, it would be better, it would be superior if our communities just rallied around together and took care of the person that is in need. We are not structured to do that anymore. Very few of us even know our neighbors anymore. I mean, it's really devastating. And so to be able to just up and quit insurance is, depending on the type of it, is really tough. I mean, there's some great kind of transitions back to familiarity and such as like Samaritan Health Share, which I just think is luminous, where you're giving money directly to other persons. You don't know them, but it's their name on the check and stuff like that, instead of a kind of this tectonic structure together that really does inhibit your ability to give yourself personally to another. And structures like that, John Paul II called structures of sin. Um, but retreat, like getting out of those, really takes a long time. I mean, our way of transformation, of bringing all things back to Christ. I mean, this is a long project that we're undertaking. It's a 500-year project. We're not going to be able to do it overnight. And so I'd say that for folks hearing this, maybe that there is like a proper patience that we have to have along with our absolute determination to change and to see that society transformed.
Yeah, two things. First, I really appreciate your nuance to these really complex and difficult topics, especially when it gets to a more personal level. But I think the principles that you gave there are going to be really helpful. And I also like that combination you gave there of patience but absolute determination, because I think when we come across these issues that just seem so colossal, we can become convinced that like there's actually nothing I individually can do here, which is just a lie. Like we are able to make progress. And I think we often think that if my progress isn't measurable on a societal scale, then it's not meaningful. But I think what we want to have is that determination to keep going, but patience in recognizing that this isn't a thing we're going to solve overnight or in our lifetimes even.
Mhm.
So I really appreciate that. Throughout this conversation, we've naturally, I think, we've talked about work, but we've hit on money a lot because, especially in our current society, those things just kind of go hand in hand. If you asked a lot of people why they work, they would I think, tell you, if they're feeling honest, like to make money. That's kind of why they do what they do. And I think
Right.
the younger generations are being increasingly candid about that. When I talk with my coworkers, they say they talk with their parents and, oh, they do this because of, these, they like kind of paint these reasons around it. But then when you ask them why they do what they do, they say, I do it for the paycheck, which is a whole thing to get into, I suppose. But I think, through your show, New Polity, which is great, and people should definitely go listen to it, and read the articles. I've been really challenged by just the depth of our misunderstandings about money as
Mm.
Christians, not even knowing kind of our own tradition in this, and really just buying into pervasive like cultural trends when it comes to money. That we should just try to get as much of it as we can, and then try to do good things with it when we can. What would, to just kind of start on the money idea, what do you see as some of the most common misconceptions we have in the church when it comes to money?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the one that comes to mind that you hear a lot in kind of churchy context is that money is not the root of all evil. The love of money is, and I think that then opens up a huge range of sin for us to say, yeah, as long as I'm not totally dedicated to it, then what I'm doing with it is fine. And without realizing that every new technology, and money is certainly a piece of technology, transforms the context in which it's introduced. And so, one that we've already kind of pointed out, that the ubiquity of money lends itself to easy transactions instead of prolonged faithful friendships over time. It really does that, and you see this within kind of the tribal societies that didn't even operate by barter. I mean, this is kind of an important side, that barter came second after money. Their usual narrative on that is actually incorrect. That they start to radically change and break down when money is introduced, and so and obviously some of that is fine. Some of that is maybe even good, but uh, but there's a side, but we just need to recognize that money actually totally transforms our relationships. And in some cases, you just need to keep uh, far from it. So one thing that John Paul II says is that we should have the market modeled after the family, and not the family on the market, where it's kind of this commutative buying and selling, never or changing money between family members. That just should not ever happen, unless it's like a gift of money from one person to another. But you should never make a relationship that's based upon charity, upon giving and receiving, um, a true model of the Holy Trinity, one that's predicated on buying and selling. That's just wrong. I'd say that it's so much of our society. Also, we have this phrase that say it's not about the money, which means that it's absolutely about the money. That I don't. It's not about the money. I just want that more, that it reveals his honesty, as if money was the thing that revealed one's honesty. That money is kind of this secret tool that unveils the true thoughts and intentions in one's mind and one's heart. And that just really shouldn't be either. That we should be able to call the bluff on that, too, and say that this is a tool that's only good in certain contexts, but it's not really a thing that defines me or my thought process and the pattern of my life as much. So I think there's a number of things, but we just need to be on kind of high alert that there's an um, abstracting mechanism that pulls us away from reality. I mean, the mere fact that it leads us to quantify things and turn a cup of coffee into the equivalent of $4, and it takes us away from the real qualitative aspects of the things that we are enumerating, and that's wrong, and that's too bad. Like we shouldn't be distracted as much as we are in that way. Again, we should kind of use money as a tool, sure, but let it not define the pattern of our thinking, and letting the qualitative world that God truly created be the thing that speaks to us. There's so many aspects of this of money is saying that that this is really kind of challenging us. I mean, there's several virtues that the Catholic tradition has taught us uh, as to the proper use of money, such as liberality, which kind of informs us that the liberal man, the one who has, I know that's a word that kind of triggers a lot of people, but it's okay. It's liberal in a different context here. That the liberal man is one who's truly free from money, and that he always knows what it's for. That money is just a placeholder, and so you need to know what the money is holding a place for, instead of just continually stockpiling up funds in a general savings account. I mean, Christ tells us a parable about the rich fool who does that, and it doesn't go very well for him. And yet that is just constantly always putting aside 10% so that our savings always balloon. That's considered a piece of cultural wisdom today, and yet it's it's something that's taken down in the Gospels themselves. I mean, there's so many aspects, I would say, that kind of fall prey to so many aspects of our kind of monetary wisdom of today that falls prey to biblical critique, and there's a handful of them for you.
Yeah, and I know you have so many more. And I'd add on that not only is this idea of saving kind of this cultural influence that we have, but at least in the context that I grew up in the church, I grew up in kind of like a large non-denominational church. They taught
Hmm.
like financial peace classes from Dave Ramsey, and like the saving was taught as like not only just a cultural good, but almost like a Christian good. And then when we
Yeah.
look at the message, like I think there's so much confusion there, and that it's really difficult for people that when they begin to hear you talk about things like retirement accounts or the stock
Mhm.
market or any of these things, it
Mhm.
just feels completely foreign to them, not only culturally, but they've never heard this from their pastors, their priests. They're just not hearing this anywhere. And I'd be curious, I'm sure there's a lot of reasons, but I know one thing that came up, and you did a debate with Trent Horn over
Yeah.
retirement, and I remember reading the like essay you wrote afterwards, and there was this point that there's not really bishops or really hardly anyone talking about this stuff these days as far as teaching about the sin of speculation or different things like that. Why do you think it is that these teachings on money are so dormant in the church today?
Um, yeah, it's such an important question. I think that the answer in part is because we are all um, up to our eyeballs in the monetary economy, and that we are all worried about having to up and change our lifestyles. So there's these kind of funny things that happen, like the um, USCCB, the United States uh, 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 bishops got together and wrote a document on kind of ethical investing. And some things that they said is that you have to vote. Like, if you're going to be invested in the stock market, then you have to vote. Well, that means that that mutual funds are completely not allowed then. It's like you don't have the ability to vote if you are only invested through mutual funds. And in fact, actually, if you are directly holding a company, then your vote actually is only a suggestion to the board of directors, and it actually has no power either.
And for
There's
clarity,
a
you mean like voting in the company? Like not voting
right,
like,
yeah.
oh, okay. Got it.
Yeah, voting in the company, I'm sorry. And there's a lot in corporate law on this, but there's a real separate the way that the legal literature um, talks about it is a separation between ownership and control. And this is it's very clear legally. I mean, it is just like no disputes on it. Nobody kind of outside the Christian world cares about this at all. I mean, it's just all settled and it's going swimmingly, in many ways for them. But within the Christian world, we'll say things. The USCCB has said things like you have to vote. It's like, well, okay, I guess no Catholic can have a mutual fund then. And yet, I'm not sure if that technical piece of knowledge is really clear in the minds of a lot of of churchmen, actually. So I think that part of the reason is that we all love money, but part of the reason is that our modern monetary economy is so complicated that it's hard to track some of these things, and thus it's hard to then apply the principles the church has given us to what's going on today. So I don't think it's all we're trying to justify our sin. I think it also is just really complicated.
Yeah, there's so many layers here, and as if, finances themselves weren't complicated enough, adding in, and I guess this shouldn't be like an additive, but trying to align this with your faith and think theologically about it makes it increasingly complex, right? You have not just kind of legal considerations or financial considerations, but you're asking higher level questions. Just out of curiosity, because
Yeah.
perhaps it'll elucidate a point for people or a principle that they're not familiar with. Why is it that the Council of Bishops there are saying that you need to be able to vote? Like, what's that connection between voting in the
Yeah.
company and making the investment okay?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it really comes down to first principles here. I'll just say when you said like trying to understand what's happening financially and what's happening technically, and then being able to value that theologically, is that a lot of times we'll kind of justify things theologically after we've already come to the conclusion that we like that thing. Like for instance, like the and this is no endorsement for socialism at all, but like absolutely not. But like a lot of like free marketers will say things like, "Yeah, like the free market allows us to exercise our creativity, which is like God's own creativity." But that's clearly already trying to put forward theological principles that justify a position that we already have. And so when the bishops do something like say that voting is important, they're actually not making that mistake. They're going right back to Labor McPherson's. They're going right back to Genesis 1, in which understands an intricate connection between ownership and responsibility, and ownership and work. So how do you have a claim to own anything? When God created the world, he gifted it not just to some of us, but to all of us. So then how can I say that this little plot of land is mine? Well, the answer that the tradition has given us is work. That just as uh, God kind of manifests himself in some ways in creation, so that again, reading the book of creation, we can know something about God, that his likeness is somehow reflected in everything that he made. So when we work and we transform something, our likeness is in the thing that we made, and so there's that likeness is part of our claim to it. This is John Paul II's teaching in Labor McPherson's. Okay, so that means that there's an intricate connection between ownership and work, but then also once you have a claim to it, what you've made is ultimately for the common good. That is still supposed to serve you, who are part of the common good, and the rest of the community. And so, if you gave up your responsibility of the thing, then you would actually of what you owned, then you would actually have surrendered your charge to use what you have for the good of others. So it's very clear in the case of like a dog. If I own a dog, but then I don't train my dog, I don't have responsibility over the dog, not only would the dog potentially die, but if he's not trained well, he could go around and bite my neighbors, and they would have every right then to shoot the dog, and maybe even shoot me for failing to train the dog well, right? That there is an absolute intricate connection between ownership and responsibility. As the Venerable Fulton Sheen said, that we all think about the farmer who has the right to ride his horse because it's his horse, but we also have to remember that he has a responsibility, the care and the feed him too, and that defines all forms of ownership for within the Catholic tradition, and it supplies from those first principles of work and ownership that the church has taught. And so there's no difference then as it pertains to ethical investments too. If you claim ownership of it, you have some responsibility for it.
which is completely different than the vast majority of investing. Like you said, that would take mutual funds essentially off the table for all Catholics if you're following that principle of
Mhm.
to invest, you have to have some type of vote in the company there. So,
Right, but I just want to clarify
yeah,
real
go,
quick
please do.
that I just want to reemphasize that that is such a technical point that I'm not even sure that it's clear that the
Mm,
bishops know that they're doing it in that document. So I don't want to
I
say this
see.
is like universal teaching of the church. I just think that it's a point of, well, if we really take this seriously, it gets
Mm,
really, I mean, the implications are pretty um, radical. So,
yeah. Yeah,
mhm.
and that's helpful that we're not necessarily like putting down magisterial authority on this, but maybe if we follow out the principles there and what they seem to be thinking, that it could land
Yeah,
you in a place like this. And
yeah,
with that in mind, and with kind of the scope of what we've talked about with money, I think there might be people out there who listen to some of your episodes, read some of your essays, perhaps
yeah.
listen to this interview and say, like, this is compelling. Like, I think our financial system is broken. I think not just structurally at a large scale, but I think probably the way I'm handling my own finances
Mhm.
is broken, that I've swallowed kind of the cultural teaching wholesale, and I haven't really done the work of thinking theologically, thinking Christianly about these things. Where do they start? Because I imagine that's an overwhelming feeling. So if you were to give them just like one piece of advice on maintaining perhaps that patience with this is a big problem, but also that persistence of this is something that we can't give up on, where do they start?
Yeah, million. I mean, no doubt in the chapel. You start on your knees. You start in prayer, and you just have to lay out in quite a meaningful and a terrifying way uh, your baptismal promise to the Lord again and saying, I am wholly yours. Direct me. I want to see your face more clearly. Help me to be able to. That's where you start. I really genuinely believe also that we can't really have some radical financial change in our life if we're not living near friends and family. And that if money really does take the place for where love lacks, that means that we really need to cultivate real love and real connection with people. And so to get up and leave where you are is not a way of surrendering. It is a chance for you to begin to engage for the very first time. And so, so there might be some, just as the early church did, they got up and moved towards to be by other Christians. We're probably going to have to do exactly that again. And so I would think that. Um, questions about divesting and such are critical, and those should be done fairly early on in this process. But prayer and friendship is really the start.
I love that. And it brings us right back to where we started about building Christian communities and what the kingdom
Yeah,
of God looks like here on earth. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful conversation. I want to wrap real quickly with the final four, which I do on all of my episodes, which are just kind of four
awesome.
rapid fire questions for the guest that you can answer in kind of a word, a sentence, or however much you want. But first, what has been the most fruitful habit or spiritual discipline in your life?
Oh, you know what? I just love chanting the Psalms.
Mm.
That is just such a joy. I do that every morning with my family, and we have a men's group here in town that does that together. It's the prayer book of Christ, and it I think gives you the groundwork for mental prayer, to be able to enter in more deeply into mental prayer too. And it's also the one of the greatest points of unity with friends and family too.
I love that. Outside the Bible, what has been the most impactful book on your life?
Oh man, yeah, you told me this was coming. I don't know if I could answer that. It's there's just I'll give you a different answer every week. I'm sorry. Probably I
No
would
worries.
maybe say something like the Summa of St. Thomas, but that's such a generic Catholic answer. It's so lame. Yeah.
We'll take it. We'll take it.
Yeah.
So you're having coffee with your younger self, maybe like your early undergrad self. What's one
Yeah.
piece of advice you give him for his future of theology?
Yeah, because I did end up going all the way through and getting my doctorate in theology, I would give kind of like a technical answer that probably doesn't apply to most people listening to podcasts. But I would just say start soon as possible, really understanding the different metaphysical schools out there. I think
Mm,
that is something that I came to kind of later in grad school, and it has just been such freedom to be able to think more deeply about various subjects and almost everything, actually. And so to be able to start that study earlier on would have been great.
I'm sure there's a whole fascinating interview you could do just on that topic.
Yeah.
Well, final question. This channel is called Gospel Simplicity. It's often pointed out that the conversations are a bit on the complex side, prompting some people to say the channel should really be called Gospel Complexity. But to bring it back to the name of the channel, if you were to put in a sentence, what is the gospel?
Yeah, the gospel is Christ's death, burial, resurrection, and true triumph over Satan, sin, and death. But that includes all temporal powers too, so that we don't just say that, Kyrios Caesaros, that Caesar is Lord, but Jesus is Lord, and it's time to join his army. That's really the gospel in a nutshell, and praise God that He has asked us to be His infantryman.
Amen. Well, Dr. Imam, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a pleasure. And thanks to all of you who are watching this sometime in the future for your time as well. I don't take that lightly. I'll end as I always do by saying until next time, be on the lookout for more videos. And as always, go out and love God and love others, because truly, above all else, that will change the world.